Tuning is the make or break process for any stabilized remote head, where you are refining the control loop to better meet the demands of your application. Payload, type of work, and even what you're mounted to all play an important role in optimizing your tuning settings. But without proper process or training, tuning can be frustrating and even ruin the shot. In this video, we're taking a deep dive into Titan tuning, so that you're armed with the knowledge that you need to get the best performance out of MotoCrane Titan. As we talked about in the Titan technical walkthrough video, gimbal payloads should be built with as much end-to-end stiffness as possible, which means that you're taking any steps necessary when you're building the payload to minimize or eliminate any flexibility from the front of the payload all the way to the rear. So as you're preparing your gimbal payload for Titan, make sure you're observing these best practices. One of the most exciting things about Titan is that it can handle massive zoom lenses. So we want to make sure we're handling that massive lens properly. And this means proper lens support. So you want to make sure that underneath the lens, you at least have one point where you are grabbing onto that lens. The top rail of Titan also allows for you to potentially grab the top of the lens as well, which gives you even more stiffness. But you want to make sure that you are at least supporting the lens underneath onto the 19mm rods or whatever rod system you're using to make sure that the lens is not just one big hanging mass off of the camera body's mount. Titan is an airy dovetail based system, which means that you have an airy dovetail mounted to the bottom of the Titan crossbar, and then a bridge plate and 19mm rods that come toward the front of the payload. Those 19mm rods are obviously where we have our lens support connected to. But what about the rods themselves to the dovetail? Without some kind of wedge plate, like the unit we're using here from Wooden Camera, the rods are just floating over the dovetail. So make sure you're using something like a wedge plate or some other means to make sure that the rods are supported by the dovetail itself. Now, accessories are a part of every gimbal payload package, and they're not a problem as long as they're properly secured. So be wary of these pitfalls as you're mounting accessories to the payload. The first potentially problematic accessory is batteries or battery plates. You want to make sure that if you're using a battery plate that it's securely mounted to the payload and not a style that's mounted to the rods that has some sort of vertical flexibility on it. In this case here, we have one mounted to the back of this Komodo body, and it's very durably or rigidly connected to the back of the camera body. We also, of course, have our built-in power on Titan so that you can forego a battery altogether and just run 24 volts or 12 volts power as it's needed directly from Titan. The second potentially problematic accessory are these articulating arms or mini magic arms or Noga arms, whatever you want to call them. And these handy little devices allow us to basically mount a quarter 20 accessory anywhere on our payload. But be careful to not have them fully extended and unsupported like this and be a source of vibration. So make sure that you're retracting these as much as possible, and when they're in this position, potentially even using a bongo tie or some kind of elastic to secondarily secure the accessory to the payload. The next accessory that could cause problems is your matte box. Now, matte boxes are made in a variety of form factors and styles. This is a bright tangerine unit here, and I like this one because it clips directly to the end of our lens, which we've taken great care to make sure that the lens itself is a very rigid member. Other matte boxes are rod mounted, some are swing away, and either of those can be a source of vibration. So just pay attention to what matte box you're using. Once it's mounted, make sure that there's no play or give in it, and potentially a source of vibration as we get into gimbal tuning. Now let's take a look at the tuning values on the Titan controller, talk about what each value does, and how we'll use them to solve problems that we see in the field. So it's assumed at this point that your payload is built, installed, and properly balanced within Titan. If you have any questions about balance in Titan, make sure you check out our technical walkthrough video where we go through the installation of the payload and how to properly balance. Now let's get into the tuning values. So I'm going to navigate to the tuning page from my home screen here. At the top, we have this function called GPS Assist. And GPS Assist is a special mode that we created that uses GPS satellite latching to help with sustained lateral acceleration like you'd experience on a dynamic application like a tracking vehicle. When you're indoors in a studio application like this or you don't have good satellite reception, we're going to leave GPS Assist off. Down in this section here, we have our actual tuning values for pan, tilt, and roll. And starting on the left, we have power, then stiffness, control, and then LPF. And all of these values get populated when I choose a tuning preset here from the presets screen. So for this particular payload, I'm going to be using the medium preset. That's because it could certainly be larger if I were to use something like a 24 to 290. It could also be a bit smaller if we were going to use something like a prime. So if you have questions about which preset is appropriate for your payload, there's a handy chart in the Titan operation manual that you can reference. So in the meantime, I'm going to grab this medium preset for this payload here. So we're going to load that preset. And now when we come to our tuning page, we have a nice starting point for tuning with this particular payload. Now that we have a tuning preset selected, let's talk about what each of these values do and how we use them to solve problems in the field. On the left, we have power. And power is basically the overall gain that is applied to the stabilization loop. And even if you have stiffness and control up at reasonable values, if power is set too low, there isn't really enough gain that is applied to the stabilization loop. So the footage is probably going to look pretty crummy. But again, the preset gets the power value into a good ballpark where you can adjust it up and down to feather that. The next value here is stiffness, which is essentially how hard the gimbal is going to work to try to maintain that target angle. When stiffness is too low, you're going to typically see a slow stabilization issue where it doesn't look like it's trying hard enough to really maintain that target angle. And when it's too high, you're probably going to see overshoot. So even in a stationary situation like this, if you had stiffness too high, you'd basically have this oscillating back and forth. And then control, if you're coming from an ARRI SRH platform, control is very similar to a D-term. And your D-term is essentially going to be your damping to make sure that you land right on the target and not overshoot. So when your control value is too high, you're going to hear buzzing or a very, very high frequency oscillation. And if it's too low, it's basically going to be that your stiffness is too high relative to it, and you're going to probably have like a low frequency oscillation. And the last value that we have on the right is LPF, which is low pass filter. And LPF, or low pass filter, basically filters out frequencies above a certain value to make sure that you don't get oscillation, buzzing, or humming. Now that we understand the process of selecting a tuning preset for your payload, and we have a basic understanding of what each of these tuning values does, let's visit our friends over at Picture Factory, who are going to help us showcase Titan in a real-world environment where we can put this knowledge to the test and solve any stabilization issues we might see. So we're here at Picture Factory with my friend and Titan owner, Craig Peterschmidt, who's helping us out here today with this Super Techno 30. We're all mounted up and ready to go. And the first thing that we want to do is see how that medium tuning preset is responding to this new support structure. Again, we did that tuning preset in the lounge at MotoCrane on a set of sticks. So we want to see how it's working on this new support. So the first thing that I'm going to do to make sure I'm able to diagnose, any kind of tuning issue is first go to my monitor page and then navigate to scope. And I'm going to turn on all 3 gyros. And the purpose of this is to make sure that when I turn motors on with this tuning preset, is I want to see what issues are happening. I want to see which axis is responding better or worse to whatever that tuning preset is, so that I can go back to tuning and adjust my power levels accordingly. So I'm here at the monitor page on the Titan controller. I'm going to turn motors on and we're going to watch the scope here. And as I move the camera around, I'm going to try to get it to oscillate and see which axis is causing the problem. So we have motors on. I'm going to start panning around and moving the gimbal into all of its positions I'll be using it in. And right away I can see that the highest frequency problem is on pan axis. So I'm going to go to my tuning page and I'm going to bring power down from 145 and make a big sweeping change. I'm going to bring that down to 95. And I'm going to continue that movement around while looking at scopes and see if I've solved that problem. So again, I'm back at the scope stage of monitor. I'm going to continue moving around and see if I have any more oscillation that we just experienced. So in all positions, tilting up, down, panning around, I'm not able to create any oscillation. So we're ready to actually start moving the support structure and actually get a shot and look through the monitor and see if we see any stabilization issues that would then warrant some tuning measures. So I'm going to get a shot framed up here of our Cayenne tracking vehicle. And we'll start on the wide side of the lens. And this is an Optimo 17 to 80, so this is at 17 mil on this camera here. And Craig, whenever you're ready, let's get a nice slow move on the Cayenne. So in the wide, we're looking good. Now I'm gonna punch into the long end of the lens at 80 millimeters, get a nice close-up framed of one of the headlights here to really start to look at the stabilization quality. All right, go ahead, let's do that once more. So as we're telescoping in and out, doing that close-up of the headlight at 80 mil, I'm able to see a little bit of tilt shake. So I wanna make sure that we remedy that in tuning. So the first thing I'm gonna do is just gonna take power up from the current level on the preset from 91 to 105, and then run the move again to make sure that that little bit of shake is now completely gone and we're rock solid at 80 mil. And Craig, whenever you're ready, let's take the move again and make sure we're rock solid. Awesome. So now we're going to move over to a tracking vehicle, and we're going to apply these same principles to achieve rock solid stabilization, but in a much more dynamic environment. So we've got our tracking vehicle here, which is an Audi Q5 equipped with the Flowcine dual black arm, tranquilizer, and then of course Titan. So let's see how that tuning preset works in the real world and what adjustments we can make to achieve perfect stabilization. Let's go. So first thing that I'm going to do when I get into the tracking vehicle is I'm going to punch into the long end of the lens, in this case 80 millimeters on this Optimo 17 to 80. And that's going to help me scrutinize and actually see any of the stabilization issues that I'm solving for. If I stay on a wider field of view, I might not actually be able to see any of the stabilization issues that are occurring, and I won't be able to solve for them. So first thing we're going to do is going to punch into 80. And the first thing that I noticed when we turned motors on was that because we have the Flowcine tranquilizer anti-vibration mount, is we have too much pan power right now. So I brought my pan power down from 145, which was from the tuning preset, all the way down to 80. The next value that I'm going to adjust is actually LPF. And the reason is because for tracking vehicles, we have frequencies that are incoming that are higher, and we need to be able to handle those higher frequencies effectively. So I'm going to take my LPF value from 30 up to 50. Next, we're going to adjust our stiffness. And again, the reason is for tracking vehicles where that tuning preset value is a good average value, stiffness, if set too high, can actually cause a little bit of overshoot, and we're going to see that especially at the long end of the lens. So I'm going to take my stiffness down from 50 to 30. The last value that I want to adjust is control. And if you remember, control is basically our damping as we're approaching the target angle. So within the stabilization control loop, by bringing control up higher, it's going to help to soften around the target angle as we have incoming disturbances. So I'm going to bring my control value from around 200 up to 240. Now, as I look at the footage with these adjustments, it's looking really amazing. We haven't even had to touch tilt or roll. And the pan axis tends to be the most temperamental or the most difficult to tune, and that just is based on how the frequencies from a tracking vehicle are translating into the gimbal itself. The pan axis tends to be where shake or vibration is seen mostly. If I look at my scopes here and we're just looking at the other two axes, I'm able to see a little bit from roll, but nothing that is concerning. If I just look at tilt, it's basically rock solid and doesn't need any adjustment. So you can use your monitor scope as well for diagnosing any stabilization issues in this environment too. With those adjustments we've made to the pan axis power, stiffness, control, and LPF, we've got great results at telephoto focal lengths on Titan. So we've done a detailed walkthrough of our payload to make sure that we got the best end-to-end stiffness and setting our payload up for tuning success, as well as in a deep dive into the tuning values on the Titan controller and 2 applications where we can put that knowledge into practice. If you still have questions about how to get the best performance out of Titan, make sure you get in touch. We'd be happy to help. Thank you for watching.